Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. This week's Technique Tuesday video is a follow-up to my last Technique Tuesday, where I demonstrated how to knit a fake in the round swatch without long strands of yarn at the back of the work. I demonstrated the process using a solid color yarn and a stitch pattern that was significantly different than stockinette gauge. I had a number of comments asking how to use this technique to swatch for stranded color work, so that's what I'll demonstrate today. If you haven't seen that first video, I'll link to that at the top of the screen as well as down in the video description. So I started my swatch with a few rows of garter stitch just to establish one of the colors. And one of the things that I do when I'm working a stockinette swatch is I cast on fewer stitches than I actually want for the stockinette for the garter stitch portion, because garter stitch tends to flare a little wider than normal stockinette. With stranded color work, that's even more the case. The stranded color work stitches tend to be narrower but taller, so the proportions change a little bit. So you don't have to do this, but if you want to, I wanted 30 stitches for stockinette, so I cast on 27 for the garter stitch. And then in my final row of garter stitch, I just did a few knit front back, so to bring my stitch count up to 30. And that'll just help a little bit with the flare. When you actually go to measure your swatch at the end, you're going to be measuring away from this edge. So any stitch distortion that you get from the garter stitch shouldn't be a problem in the location where you're going to be measuring. But that's what I do. I'm ready to join the other colors so I can start doing some stranded color work. So what I do is I just tie this on here so that the two are joined and there's some tension on this particular yarn tail right at the start. I'm going to work the first stitch and the last stitch of every row with both of these colors. You can insert your needle and then just wrap both colors around like this, and they have been established. And now you can tension the yarns, the two strands of yarn in your hands the way that you need to do for how you work stranded color work. Some people hold both strands in their left hand, some hold both in their right hand. I tend to hold one in each hand. So I'm going to tension the light green in my left hand and the dark green in my right hand. Again, this is how I do stranded color work. If you do it a different way, do it the way that you normally work. And then I'm just going to work across in whatever the stitch pattern calls for this first row. As I get to the end of the row, I want to work just as I did with the single color. I wanted to work the last 3 stitches through the back to twist those stitches. So I'm going to work one of them in the light green. I'm going to work one in the dark green, and then I'm going to work both of them together with the same, with both colors. Now is the time when we need to measure off a bunch of yarn, and then we start knitting with this yarn that we measured off. So all of this slack that we've pulled off, this is the yarn that we're going to use to knit across here, and that will leave the yarn that the balls, the yarn attached, that will leave that hanging at the right hand edge. I'm going to make a suggestion about how much to measure off, and that is to measure off 3 times the width of this swatch, and then we'll talk about afterwards what's actually going on. So 1, 2, 3. So, and always it's okay to have extra, so we're going to have a little bit extra. Again, we're going to work this first stitch using both colors. So So we've got these two right here are in both colors. We're going to knit them again with both colors. And now we can tension the yarn in the hands that we need to in order to do our color work. So I'm going to use, again, the light green in my left hand and then the dark green in my right hand. So it really helps to have that first stitch with both colors mounted and anchored in there so that you can then tension the yarn. So now I'm going to work across again. I work it a little bit differently than I did last time. Again, when you get to the end of the row, you're going to work on them through the backs of the stitches, and the last one is going to be worked together. And then you leave the remaining yarn just hangs from the right or from the left edge there. So now when you're ready to begin the next row, they're both over at this edge, and you can work another right side row using both yarns as you normally would going across. So I want to explain a little more deeply why I was suggesting that when you are measuring off yarn in order to knit from the big loop, that you measure off 3 widths of the swatch. When the colors are balanced, like you're using very close to the same number of stitches of each of the 2 colors, the amount of yarn that you actually need to work stranded color work in those 2 colors is 2 times the width for each of the colors. You need to add additional slack for tensioning around your fingers so that you can maintain your normal knitting style. And for English style knitting, 5 or 6 inches is typically what you might need. So if you hold both yarns in your left hand when you are doing stranded color work, you might not need this much, and you will be able to tell after a couple of rows if you can get away with, say, 2.5 measurements. You need the 2 to be able to knit all of the stitches, and then you need another 5 or 6 inches for the tensioning slack. And since this swatch is 6 inches wide, it's easy just to measure off 3. Now, that's for if the 2 colors are balanced across a row. If they're not balanced, if one color has a lot more stitches than the other, you're going to need more yarn in that color that has more stitches. And in that case, you can just measure off 1 more width of the swatch, and that should be enough for the dominant color. It's going to be way more than enough for the lighter color. I find it's just easier to measure them both out the same than to try to calculate how much I'm going to need for this color versus that color, and am I holding it in my left hand so I don't need as much slack for tensioning, or am I holding it in my right hand, or am I doing one of each? Then you don't have to think about it so much. None of this yarn is wasted. It's hanging here at the side. This type of swatch allows you to be able to measure this swatch flat and get really good results. And then if you find at the end of your project that you're running short on yarn, you can always rip this out and reuse the yarn. So that's an advantage over this style of doing the swatches, where if you don't make these long enough, the edges curl, and then you might have to cut the yarns, making it not usable. And also you can't make this lie flat. It's just you've got all of these extra strands here, and it can be a little bit harder to get an accurate gauge with this style of a fake in the round swatch. So I was holding 1 yarn in each of my hands as I was doing stranded color work. This is a very common method. It's not the only one. There are several different methods of working stranded color work. When I hold 1 yarn in each hand, I get what are called parallel floats on the back of the work. So I was holding the light green in my left hand, and so you can see those horizontal strands here, and they are running in parallel with the dark green ones, but the dark green ones are up higher. Those were the ones that were held in my right hand. You can get parallel floats if you hold both in your right hand or both in your left hand. And But there's another method of working stranded color work, and that's what is called rotating floats. So like I said, these are parallel and these are very horizontal. So this is the back side of a different piece of knitting, and here you have those parallel floats where you see those horizontal strands of the two colors. And on this one, they're at an angle. And so none of them is above the other. They always go from lower to upper and then lower to upper. And this was done by, when I had a color change, I twisted the yarns together. So this is a technique that knitters in various knitting traditions might use, or they might use parallel floats, or they might use a combination. They create different effects on the right side of the work, and I'll link to a video up at the top as well as down below if you want to understand the difference and identify which style you use. If you use the rotating floats method, you might encounter some issues using this particular fake in the round swatching technique. Maybe, maybe not. Just because when you're working across those rows where the yarn is attached at both ends and you're working with what's in between, you might have trouble rotating those strands around each other, or you might not. But that's just something to keep in mind, that there can be some limitations with this technique, like any technique. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.